Good evening. My name's Keith Jones and I have the privilege of being the president of the Baptist Historical Society. Over 12 months ago, we held our annual general meeting and the General Secretary of the Baptist Union kindly sent us a greeting. She noted the excellent work we do through our Baptist Quarterly Journal and in various academic enterprises, but she posed to us a question: how can you popularize the work you're doing and interest others in Baptist history and identity? This series of 4 webinars is our first attempt to do that. We're taking some classic themes of Baptist history and dissent, explaining those, and then interacting with people who perhaps have a contemporary reflection upon them. There's a chance for you to engage with that, and we hope you will. Our desire is to bring alive for a new generation key insights from our history, our tradition, but what it means to be truly Baptistic in our own generation. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Christy now, who is chairing this evening.
Thank you, Keith, and a warm welcome to everyone to this, the second in our series of 4 online webinars uncovering our Baptist story. My name's Chris Joynes. I'm Director of the Centre for Baptist Studies at Regent's Park College, Oxford, and I have the pleasure of chairing this evening's discussion, where our theme is Fellowship and Connection. Each webinar is focused around a keynote paper, this evening presented by Stephen Copson. There will then be 2 responses from Wale Hudson-Roberts and Andy Goodliff, before we then open up the floor for questions and conversation with the panel from you all. As last time, I'd like to request that questions are sent via the chat button, and please make sure that you click on panelists and everyone so that the questions are visible to everyone here tonight. I should also alert you to the fact that the session is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube for subsequent viewing. And whilst your faces can't be seen, your questions will be heard. So now I'm going to spend a moment just introducing the 3 panelists tonight. Firstly, Stephen Copson, our keynote speaker, and familiar to many of us here through his work as Secretary of the Baptist Historical Society. We're immensely grateful for the work he does in tirelessly promoting the importance of Baptist history. He has particular expertise on English Baptists in the 18th century, the focus of his graduate research and the book he co-edited entitled Challenge and Change, which is available to buy on the Baptist Historical Society website. Most recently, he's just finished editing a volume of essays on the Salters Hall debates, a conference co-sponsored by the Centre for Baptist Studies and the Baptist Historical Society, which I believe will shortly be available on Amazon. He's also a regular writer and book reviewer for the Baptist Quarterly, and in addition he serves as a regional minister in the Central Baptist Association. Wale Hudson-Roberts is a Baptist minister and was appointed in 2002 as the Baptist Union of Great Britain's first racial justice coordinator, striving to see the Baptist Union become racially just. He continues to hold this crucial role and has recently also taken up the pastorate at John Bunyan Baptist Church, Oxford. Wale is also a linchpin in the Sam Sharp project, and I'm sure would want me to draw your attention to the 2020 Sam Sharp lecture coming up on the 12th of October, another project which he's pioneered in raising the profile of the need for racial justice. And in addition, he's initiated a forthcoming multi-ethnic preaching volume as a resource to help churches promote racial justice, to which he is a contributor and which should be available in early 2021. So keep your eyes open for that. And last but not least, Andy Goodliff is an ordained Baptist minister at Bellevue Baptist Church, Southend-on-Sea. He completed his PhD at St Andrews under the supervision of Steve Holmes and the fruits of that labour are soon to emerge in the form of a monograph published by Whitford entitled Renewing a Modern Denomination, a Study of Baptist Institutional Life in the 1990s, which I believe may be out in time for Christmas. Andy's also co-editor of the recent volume Reconciling Rights, Essays in Honour of Myra Blythe. He's renowned for his energy in promoting Baptist research, as evidenced in the excellent initiative Theology Live and the new Journal of Baptist Theology in Context, both of which he co-founded. And I'm delighted to be in such wonderful company this evening as we engage with this theme, uncovering our Baptist story, fellowship and connection. So I'll hand over now to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. For those who were here last week, you will have scaled the heady heights of radical religion and dissenting principles. Today, we come to the more earthed, perhaps, idea of how Baptists organised themselves to collaborate over the years. What I will hope to offer are some thoughts and almost pegs to hang questions and ideas upon that I hope will be drawn out in conversation. When there was one Baptist church, it was a pioneer. When there were two, it was because of a split. When there were several, they collaborated. So over 4 centuries, English Baptists have worked together in identifiable networks. Self-defining associations from the 1650s, sometimes consociations, a connection, an assembly, a union. There have been general or Arminian Baptists, particular or Calvinist Baptist, strict and particular when the particulars were not strict enough, gospel standards when the strict and particulars were not gospel enough. Latterly, even those independent Baptists have often sought the umbrella cover of groups like Grace Assembly or the Federation of Independent Evangelical Churches, which, if not avowedly Baptist, emphasize the desire to be linked together for some purposes. Over time, associations have been determined by a range of criteria: like-minded ministers, geographical proximity, doctrinal congruence or local government boundaries, and national identities. With such variety and breadth, perhaps I may be forgiven for compressing the story or finessing the details. And in the main, my observations will relate to the old General Baptists, the particular Baptists, and the new connection, those latter two merging in 1891 to form an enlarged Baptist Union. In the early days, there was little machinery or organisation attached to associations. A record was usually kept of meetings of national and local associations and distributed as breviates to the members. Letters that were sent in each year would be held together in a book and sometimes recorded in the sending church's church book too. Churches recognised their relationships, but usually this found expression in an annual gathering. Greater organisation ultimately brought more administration, leading to oversight by secretaries, unpaid or part-time, and then increasingly more full-time. Although the larger and more prosperous associations eventually employed more staff and acquired offices. From the earliest days, there is evidence of collaborative identity. In 1626, 6 General Baptist churches from around the country co-signed a letter. In 1644, the representatives of 7 London Particular Baptists published the first Particular Baptist Confession of Faith. And in the relative freedom of the 1650s, as the number of churches increased, so they were accompanied by the pattern of meeting together in association, and it has continued to be a feature of Baptist organisation to this day. Why? To what ends? Here we have some clues, perhaps. Undoubtedly, in the early days, there was the comfort of mutual support. There were not many Baptist churches. Mistrusted by many as radicals and revolutionaries, these pioneers found encouragement and solidarity in meeting together. They were not ecclesiologically solipsistic, thinking each was the only true church. They looked at their sisters and brothers and recognized their need of one another. Later, their representatives would come together to worship, listen to a sermon from the moderator, which would be circulated to member churches for mutual edification. They supported one another. Second, in the early days, they came to explore what did it mean to be covenanted communities in this new beginning. How were they to engage with their neighbours and their local society? So they discussed questions about paying parish tithes and marrying outside the fellowship. There was little precedent and scripture to relate. Later, they would be asked to consider advice offered by working groups or other commissioned committees. As time moved on, their sphere of interest took note of the social and political issues of the day. They debated and they passed motions. One early comment is that they benefited from this collective activity as iron sharpeneth iron. They learned from sharing with one another. Thirdly, they became forums for advice and weighing disputes. In the late 18th century, in the early 18th century, the General Baptists talked Trinitarian theology in regional and national arenas. How would we do that today? Churches in the Northwest in 1719 advised a minister to accept a better paid pastorate because he had a large family. Together, associations reflected on matters of national politics and external threats to the nation, often calling days of thanksgiving or fasting. Each member church was allowed to send in queries for consideration, although there was no compulsion to act upon any advice, save for it representing the weighing of the wider body of Baptist Christians. In 1652, the Abingdon Association noted that, quote, there is the same relation betwixt the particular churches each towards the other as there is betwixt particular members of one church. They made the link. They were not a disparate group of fellowships thrown together by time or chance or even baptismal rite. They were joined together under Christ the head, and so they should extend care and concern for the others. If together members of the local church were authorized to seek the mind of Christ, what of their representatives in association? Later commentators would talk of ecclesial communities and press others to think how Christ might speak through these entities in national or even international arenas. If the members were held in covenant relations for the welfare of others, so too churches were bound together with one another, despite their outward differences. They were drawn together by Christ. Associations offered the opportunity for shared activity beyond the capacity of one or two or more local churches. The establishment of the London Baptist Association in 1865 was energised by Charles Haddon Spurgeon's determination to plant one new church each year in the growing metropolis. In the period after both World Wars, some associations planned a response to the new housing developments and new town programme. Nationally, the Home Mission endeavour, begun in some form in 1797, recycled funds to support ministries for pastorates, chaplaincies and other creative opportunities where otherwise it would have been financially impossible. They worked together for their common good. And there was the functional. One of the founding aims of the Baptist Union was, excitingly, to gather statistics. Administration has always been an activity of association and indeed union life. From the 18th century meetings, arranged a speaker and a venue for the next year. The BMS founders took up a collection. Nowadays, the more formal requirements of acting as a charity under charity law. Of these several elements, most have been present in one shape or another over the years in the collective organising, particularly of union churches, but of churches predating the union too. It must be remembered that association is a representational body made up of member churches who act or meet together by their representatives. Churches sent messengers or delegates, usually pastors or significant members, and they reported back. As time moved on, these representatives cast formal votes and mirrored some of the features of the voluntary associations and joint stock companies that flourished in the 19th century. Committees were formed to oversee specific areas of activity. Reports were made, minutes taken, actions noted. Even in the annual gathering, it was never expected that every person in the seat or pew of the churches would be wholly energized by one single vision, all volunteering, everyone a participant, everyone doing the same thing. Association was nurtured by the placing of trust in the representatives. In the 20th century, associations achieved a greater degree of consistency in their operations, with significant disruption during wartime. The latest realignment in association life was about the turn of the millennium. There was some reorganisation, reducing associations from 29 to 13. This was done in the name of greater efficiency and economies of scale, as well as bringing the paid association ministers to local accountability and allowing a greater focus on mission. In the past half century, the reality of association life has been impacted in different ways by cooperation in local ecumenical activity, the appeal of parachurches with a strongly defined doctrinal stance, and the levelling experience of charismatic renewal across the traditions. The Baptist Union report relating and resourcing in 1998 made the distinction between associating and association. This was a useful, if ultimately perhaps a limited, analysis. Similarly, the emphasis upon movement over institution. It is possible just to read into this categorization an underlying distinction between the life-giving mission versus the dead hand of administration, or the re-emergence of a dualism, elevating the spiritual above the bodily. An idea without hands floats. An organisation without a vision merely functions. They need to be seen as equal partners in the creative missio Dei. In the mid-18th century, the Northampton Association, for a short time covering St Albans to Derby, was the stirrer of ministers and congregations, the promoter of the revival of prayer, a gathering of collective and spiritually thoughtful ministers, and the midwife of the BMS. It is sometimes said that people now do not join things. They have lost their trust in organisations and institutions. Perhaps the increasing disenchantment that may be seen from some quarters in Baptist institutions is part of this zeitgeist, or maybe disillusion in those bodies to deliver the kingdom on earth, or the conversion of the masses. In preparing this, I came across something that almost got said at Baptist Union Council a couple of years ago. Just after Neville Callan, the General Secretary of the Baptist World Alliance, had spoken in the magazine about churches, unions being ecclesial communities. It helped to think at a time when Baptist Union was rebranding as Baptist Together, what it meant to be a union. For me, union bears the weight of our sense of being together better than any other term we use, although the journey is not always easy or simple or comfortable. A union is an ecclesial body. It is one where people commit themselves, churches commit themselves to one another, to work together, to listen, to give and take, a multi-voiced dialogue. It is a community of difference. Commitment in union is to take the risk of listening for God, making room for different insights, making space for awkward neighbours, to hear the still small voice among the clamour, to offer generous hospitality around the table, and to use God-given resources aright. In this brief and necessarily foreshortened discussion starter, it has been suggested that collective and committed relationships and activity have been a consistent feature of Baptist life, among most streams of Baptist conviction, although they have evolved as the context has changed over the years. Associations, or indeed union, should be vehicles for this conviction to be expressed, bringing together as Baptists the breadth of experience and expectation of congregations that differ in style, leadership, and outlook. In words appropriated from elsewhere, unity in reconciled diversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I was looking for the clap function, but perhaps we can gesture like so, or do a thumbs up to indicate appreciation. I can't find the reactions button here, but maybe others can. So I'm going to hand over now to Wale to offer the first of the two responses, please. Thank you, Wale.
Even though I found Stephen Copson's paper, Stories of Fellowship and Connectedness, helpful, it is a British ecclesial expression of Baptist forming relationships. Therefore, in my brief response, I plan on presenting an alternative to Stephen's British Baptist's interpretation, and I want to title this African Stories of Fellowship and Connectedness, during which I plan on providing an overview of two African principles, both relating to associating, relating, and resourcing, be it through an alternative historical and theological lens. The first relates to age and associating. Because in African theology, the elderly are seen as very mature reflectors of the image of God, as it were, they are attributed masses of respect. Therefore, discerning the mind of Christ in a church meeting or similar gathering requires the gathered to take very seriously the wisdom of the aging. This is not about undermining the thoughts, ideas, and wisdom of the young, but rather a recognition and appreciation that African ancestors, though physically absent from life in the here and now, still their voices continue to influence the way in which African Baptists relate and associate and resource each other. Even from the grave, African ancestors continue to pass on proverbial wisdom to the young. This is in part because the African tradition is deeply oral. It is a deeply oral tradition, and wisdom through storytelling is passed on from generation to generation, beginning often with African ancestors who, though physically dead, their proverbs live on and shape collective identity. Wale Soyinka reminds us, our African ancestors, I quote, symbolizing age, shape African theology and shape community well-being. All this points to the importance of age, which in the African tradition metaphorically lives on and on and on. I can never understand why I was strongly encouraged to sometimes prostrate when certain people entered into our home. I now realize that this was not about the person's status in life. Rather, it constituted a respectful physical gesture for the accumulation of wisdom gathered over years by the aging Baptists, or even guessed. So how does this then relate to discerning the mind of Christ as Baptist? Well, it means that in an African context, discernment will always take into consideration the historical wisdom of appropriate African ancestors, asking the question, what would they say about this matter if they too were reflecting on this matter in the here and now? What wisdom would they bring to the table alongside the wisdom of the physically gathered community seeking discernment? I'm saddened that so many of my white retired colleagues feel that their voices no longer matter while associating. In the Yoruba understanding of Baptist ecclesiology, one's voice never dies. It lives on, and it shapes the present as well as the future. However, this holistic respect for discernment as Baptist is undergirded by my second point, which is Ubuntu, which I briefly want to develop before I conclude. The African understanding of Ubuntu means that in certain conditions, the individual can be sacrificed for the well-being of the corporate body. The African understanding of Ubuntu means that the highest moral good is that of serving the common good with one's material and spiritual resources. Consequently, many Africans have less complications in understanding the sacrificial view of the atonement. This is because such a view of human sacrifice is deeply rooted in the African understanding of Ubuntu, covenanting together, or doing Ubuntu together, calls for voluntary sacrificial commitment from within the community. Indeed, Africans have generally been baffled by the Christian missionaries' condemnation of human sacrifice, while simultaneously advancing the sacrificial death of Jesus. For many traditional Africans, this remains a theological conundrum. Now, this might be difficult for some, even Baptists, to grasp, but African Baptists have no conception of person apart from the community. This means more than the maintenance of a symbiotic relation between the individual and the community, for such implies a prior separate state. No such separation is possible in African thought. The two are opposite sides of the same coin. Mabiti, an African theologian, puts it this way: an African does not exist alone. He or she owes her existence to those who live in the present and those who live in the past. Africans are part of the whole. The community must therefore create, sustain, and make the individual. Just as God made the first man and woman, so man and woman become community, and the corporate is created, connected, and associated. Thus, only in terms of other people does the person become conscious of their being, their duties, and their privileges. This means when an African suffers, they do not suffer alone. When an African rejoices, they do not rejoice alone. When an African marries, they do not marry alone. When an African is baptized, he or she is not baptized alone. And so discerning the mind of Christ is a process that is inextricably bound with the past and the present and the future, and secondly, undergirded by Ubuntu, interdependence, covenanting together. While concluding, let me put two challenges to you. Number one, why is formation and learning about relationships and associating and resourcing frequently done through the lens of British Baptists, when in truth, long before disciples of Jesus separated themselves from the Church of Rome to become dissenters and Baptists, reflecting on identity, Africans were participating Baptist principles decades before even the Anabaptists. So why is it that learning is so often one way? Secondly, and finally, if Black Baptist lives really matter, and Baptists together are serious about building anti-racist churches, associations, and colleges, then Baptists together need to be strategic and intentional in applying the richness of African history, ecclesiology, and theology in their practice.
Thank you, Wale. And again, I'm aware there is no clap button, but people have been expressing thanks in the webinar chat. So really appreciate the challenges that you've brought to us there, and we'll come back to those in the question time shortly. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Andy for the second response before we can come back and address some of those questions you've raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for your telling of the story, and Wale for your challenge, which although I don't think I can respond in my first response, I hope some responses will come out in conversation. Baptist fellowship and connectedness has never been straightforward. There's never been a blueprint to follow. It's always been something being invented, something that has changed as context has changed, or as need or purpose has changed. But it's always been there, from the beginning to today in some form. That's what I take from Stephen's presentation. Baptists are not independents, as in each local church doing its own thing by itself. They have always recognized the need, the call of God to be a people of local and wider fellowship. Although we confess it doesn't always look like that in practice. This connectedness, this fellowship is something I suggest we need to better appreciate, value, and hold on to dearly. One Baptist historian, Barry White, put it this way: fellowship is the lifestyle of the gospel. Interdependence is the mark of the converted. The search for independence was Adam's sin. Associating, networking, belonging is not something Baptists should see as optional, but as vital to their understanding of church and of mission. That, I believe, is what our history tells us and what we know is true. Yes, Baptists have always begun with the local, recognizing in it the marks of the church, but they've never remained there. They've always recognized the call of God to connect and receive fellowship with others. And this, of course, is the testimony of associations, of unions, of alliances, of networks that have been part of Baptist life, that have emerged and developed. If this is true, then why is it, though, we Baptists find fellowship and connectedness something that we often keep at arm's length? Something that we do make optional, something that we can be, or often are, suspicious of? I want to suggest several reasons. First of all, our theology, and perhaps our history as well of connectedness, of association, is not good enough. We need a better theology, or a more clearly articulated theology of church that holds local, association, and union together. History can help us. And Wale suggested some other bits of history and theologies that can help us too. Secondly, if that's true, it's not clear what it is that we share perhaps as Baptists, that we look to one another as sister churches. What is the tie that binds today? Thirdly, we operate, I think, with, if we have time, mode of thinking about associating rather than it being a priority, which perhaps takes us back again to our theology. Number 4, I want to suggest that our associations are too large. The creation of regional associations has not in general worked. The geography is too wide, the relating too poor, the identity too weak, and there's a sense of detachment between churches and what it is that they're belonging to as an association. Fifthly, I might suggest as well that association and union life is just not meaningful enough. There's too little deliberation. We work with a resource model rather than a place of listening and seeking and discerning together. Sixthly, Associating habits are not embedded into ministerial formation, although perhaps see now the new CMD that's just coming out from the union, which perhaps will remedy some of that. Seventh, we've got 10 of these. Seventh, we have a model of church that prizes self-sufficiency rather than that of interdependency. This might take us to an idea that we operate as churches more like marbles, touching one another perhaps, but remaining self-sufficient rather than honeycombs, all connected in some kind of way, perhaps also connecting back to some of what Wale was saying as well. This is not where we began. Eighth, rather than building trust, we are generally too often suspicious. Small churches suspicious of large and maybe vice versa. Evangelical churches suspicious of those that they might call liberal and vice versa. Traditional suspicious of pioneering and vice versa. The centre suspicious of the margin and vice versa. And we need and long for more bridges or more threads to hold us together. Number 9, I think we act too often with impatience. We have a problem of faddism. We're always chasing the next answer, rather than the hard work of being church or churches together. We need what some have called slow church. That's not fast asleep church, but it's also not frantic church, but it's slow church, working together what it is to live in association and union in networks. And number 10, I wonder if we have championed movement over institution. Being part of a movement sounds good. Being part of an institution often is told us to sound the opposite. There feels here some binary thinking, which Stephen hinted at as well. I wonder though if we need to value more the institutional parts of our life for what they have and still do provide, which is connection. We all remember the BU directory. And we need to remember its legacy of generosity, not just the BU directory, but all those bits of connection together, of partnership, of solidarity and other goods. Of course, institutions are never perfect and are always in need of renewal, but there's something there that holds and passes on that we shouldn't value. So I want to encourage us that our story has been one of fellowship and connectedness, but it's one that we sorely need still today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you to Simon for putting helpfully that because I missed one of them, putting your 10 pointers in the chat so that we can refer back to those. Really huge thanks to all 3 of our panelists for giving us such a lot of ideas to think about, and already there's quite a build-up of questions in the chat, so without further ado I'm going to raise those and ask you to respond to them. Some of them are directed to Stephen, some of them are directed to the 2 respondents, or others are open questions, so I'll try to steer that. So the first one comes from Craig Gardner, who asks Stephen, if iron sharpens iron, what communities of people or individuals might sharpen the life of our Baptist unions in the UK today, and what needs sharpening?
I think the quote was in the context of people coming together with a genuine desire to seek answers together and bringing their insights and their understandings, and often their scriptural understandings, to sharpen up an idea in response to a particular question. So a church would send in saying, what do you think about this? What should we do about that? And it's in that exchange, in that conversation, that metaphorically the iron is sharpened. I'm sure we could list possibly more than 10. What sort of issues one would take as needing that sort of conversation, whether in our local churches, whether in our regional gatherings, whether in our national gatherings. I would not dare to venture a list at this time.
Do feel free if any of the other panelists want to chip in and add any reflections before we move on.
I would just want to add in quickly, I can't imagine a church doing that kind of, let me ask a question and putting it out there to other churches, to an association to kind of respond and receive back. And what kind of interesting things might emerge, also challenges as well. And again, that might be learning from the wisdom of the past, as Wale was talking about it, in a sense that might speak to the present.
Thank you. A second question, which I think emerges from something that Stephen said in a particular context, but Ruth Goodborn asks, how do we overcome the dualism that assumes that administration is not a work of the Spirit?
I remember some years ago a speaker at Greenbelt saying he had not yet heard of someone being moved by the Spirit to write a letter. And perhaps there we do have a working table of higher to lower. And maybe that is in some respects expected, but it does not recognize the interwoven gifts of the Spirit, not just within an individual, but how those gifts hold together communities or even beyond communities, so that the rich tapestry that's being built up involves both social action, writing letters, speaking good news, being good news. It's a multi-layered, a multi-responsible thing. There is a temptation, I think, for all sorts of reasons. Firstly, to identify what we see as the soul activity of the Spirit, and therefore perhaps downplay the importance of other things as if they're not spiritual, which again, I think, as is implied, does somewhat say that these things are higher and these things are lower, without understanding that the breath of God blows through all our personalities and our activities.
Yeah, I'm struck also by the kind of binarism that also chimes with some of the thinking that Andy was also challenging in terms of this binary, you know, what's spiritual and what's not spiritual, that actually we do well to step back from and challenge and rethink, really. So thank you for that.
And if I'm right, Paul doesn't make that distinction in Romans 12. He speaks about the gift of administration.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's a really helpful point, and I think it's also quite interesting the way that Stephen has contextualized it in the way that things have evolved historically and judgments were given, but that how this raises important questions for us in our current context that we need to be attentive to. Moving on to the a third question that I spotted in the chat from Simon Oxley. Does committed relationship between churches in association imply mutual accountability? And if so, how is that exercised in practice, especially as many churches insist on independence? Perhaps each of the panelists could respond to that. Wale, do you want to start off by giving some reflections there?
Ubuntu suggests that interdependence is absolutely critical and obviously very important, and for Ubuntu to be played out in a practical sense and for Ubuntu to demonstrate practical implications, interdependence has to be a significant part of that playing out. So one of the points that I made, and again in relation to community relationships, in relation to communion, and in relation to interdependence, where it concerns the African context, it is expected that there will be persons within the community who will make sacrifices for the wider community, which is obviously something that we see in the book of Acts. So yes, in terms of how this is reflected in real life, yeah, I think in a variety of different ways. Again, in an African context, it will be through resources. So even if you have very, very little resources, you will seek to ensure that persons within your community, persons within your village, for example, are able to go to college or to go to university. And so you will give the little you have to ensure the progress and development of younger people. Also, in terms of its practice, if there is a bereavement, again, within one's village, if somebody suddenly passes away, what tends to happen is that there will be persons within the village who will actually take on board the families, the individuals of the bereft. Again, that's a practical way of working through Ubuntu and living independently with each other. So there are so many ways in which this can be practically played out as disciples of Jesus.
Thank you. And I really appreciate, we'll come back in a moment because there's another question relating to how we might learn from the African experience you've shared in terms of helping that to see ourselves and how we might learn from those experiences better. So we will return to that in a moment. I just want to ask Andy and Stephen also if they would like to respond to Simon's question.
I was just really challenged by what Wale was talking about in terms of what would it mean to put association and union before local. And that was the challenge. And we cannot get our heads around that, I don't think, in our current way of being Baptist, perhaps historically as well as present day. But what would that mean to look to the wider and seeking to bless that before we even start with the local? I think it's just such a challenge, which requires, some thought and taking up and following.
Stephen, did you want to comment?
Just briefly, that I think there is a common understanding of the competence of the local congregation to discern together, but held within the understanding that that's not the only view, and there is the need to listen to others where there is a mutuality of genuine benefit. So what benefits everybody? And part of that beneficial activity is a flexibility that says, and this comes, I guess, to the accountability, it's not that we come together and I make you do what I want to, but we come together because we are there for the common benefit of us. I can remember an elderly deaconess who grew up in London saying, when I asked her why she was a Baptist or why she did Baptist things, she said, because just we were Baptists, so we went to Baptist meetings. And sometimes perhaps we undervalue that simple understanding of people in the chairs or in the churches or in the pews, that they are with one another because they self-identify as Baptists and want to look out for the best for others.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. I mean, I think it just struck me as you were talking. I don't know whether any empirical research has been done in terms of asking congregation, ascertaining how much connectedness there is in particular local churches and how much awareness. I was just thinking of my own Baptist church in Abingdon. I think there's quite a detachment, really a lack of awareness of a connectedness with a regional association. And so I think of that much more in our local church that operates in terms of being a resource for the minister, but not actually something that the church as a whole is connected with. So I think it would be very radical, as Andy says, to sort of turn the tables and actually put association and interconnectedness uppermost and learn from Ubuntu as Wale suggested. That's been helpful.
If I may have sorry, Wale.
I was just going to say, Wale, what do you think? A few years ago, I'm going to be provocative now, the union asked us to humbly urge to avoid doing things. And we'd have to remember that humbly urge, and I think most people on the call may know the context of that, was a double humbly urge. And we often only remember the first humbly urge. Do you think that was a model of seeking to try and do Ubuntu?
You'd have to put me on the context there a bit. So I'm not cognizant of what the urging is.
Okay, so the humbly urging was around this whole issue around sexuality. And the union said that we should humbly urge people to refrain from doing things. And I wonder if that, and it was not received well. And I wonder if that's the difficulty of local and association and Ubuntu. And I think there are reasons why it wasn't received well, but that ability to humbly urge one another becomes, I think, something difficult for us today because of that independence.
But then I think inbuilt into the African understanding of Ubuntu theology is also accountability. And and listening to elders. And then that the elders doesn't necessarily always represent age per se. Often it does, but it also represents a richness of maturity and an accumulation of wisdom, which is reflected in theological insight. And so Ubuntu would also urge that exercise of listening, particularly when urging comes from the elders, is also seriously taken into consideration as well before specific decisions, concrete decisions, are actually made by the collective.
Could I have a PS, Chris?
Yeah, sure.
Just to underline the fact that organised associations, or indeed unions, will always be at the sharp end a representative activity. You can't get everybody involved all at the same time, all in the same place, doing the same things. So the key thing that holds everybody together is a sense of trust in what others are doing. How that trust is exercised, how it's given and how it's shared out is an interesting concept, how you would do that. But if you do not have this trust, then as with other institutions, you will not believe what others are doing on your behalf unless you actually do it. And I think that's quite a difficult point, because it allows people to drift off into islands of self-concern, because the wider is they don't engage with it. It doesn't belong to them.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because I wonder whether Wale can come back on the Ubuntu idea, because that to me didn't seem to be kind of delegating to someone as your representative, but seemed to be much more integrated. And I don't know whether that's correct, or whether this idea of Ubuntu could work for us in terms of the way that association might be remodeled, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good question, Christine. I mean, I suppose it can be in the ideal world, but I imagine for Ubuntu to be played out, sensibly and carefully within our associations, it does demand certain things, and certain kind of principles perhaps need to be seriously taken into consideration to ensure that Ubuntu is thoughtfully fleshed out. And one of them is a depth of listening. Another is a depth of respect, of recognition that all people, Baptist and otherwise, are created in the image of God. Another, clearly, in terms of a value, would relate to the theological importance of diversity. And within that diversity, clearly there needs to be high levels of flexibility and so on and so forth. So I would say that there needs to be certain principles at hand here, which we kind of very carefully take into consideration. And if those principles can be applied, yes, then the possibility of Ubuntu could potentially become a reality. It is going to require a huge amount of hard work upon our part.
Thank you. And another question that came up in the chat from Craig Gardner. How do these wonderful understandings from Wale correlate to our understanding of the communion of saints? This is particularly topical because at the Centre for Baptist Studies we just last month did a day conference on the communion of saints, an approach to the communion of saints from a Baptist perspective, based around the book that Paul Fiddis and Brian Hames and Richard Kidd have co-written together, which is why they're alluded to in the second part of the chapter question here. How might the iron of our Baptist theology of communion of saints and being in God be sharpened by these African principles? And I think this is, he said it is Paul, Brian or Richard here. And in fact, a bit later on, down the chat, you'll see Paul Fiddis has said, yes, surely Wale's appeal to the wisdom of the ancestors does connect with the communion of saints. Since we are all held together in God by Christ, the living and the dead, we should expect to find the mind of Christ as we gather in association and union, and should be willing to give authority to their consultation and decision. So I think there's a really helpful additional dimension to what you were saying about the elders and about the ancestors that we can learn from your reflections on African practice. Thank you.
And I think that was a real call to value our history and our stories, and making sure that that's not a narrow history that doesn't overlook or marginalize voices, but actually here's the breadth of our history, the good and the and perhaps even the where it's not been so good, and it could actually really shape our present. And I guess that's what we those of us who are part of the Baptist Historical Society are all about. It's not just about looking back at the past, it's how does it shape our present. And I think Wale was really challenging there, us to value that in ways.
Well, and I think one of the helpful points that Stephen brought out was the way in which, although we can discern a thread of fellowship and connection as we look back at the history, it has evolved, and so that there is this kind of movement and dynamism in the way that things progress, and I like the way that it started with pioneer and then split, and then that there is this kind of movement, so things don't have to stay static and remain as we know them at the present, but that there is this dynamic movement. There's a question here. I'm just aware of time. We'll need to draw things to a close fairly soon, given the 8:30 finish time. But there's a final question here from Malcolm Yarnell. We have the mind of Christ. The plural is not without significance, is it? So I think the we in that comment. And then I'll squeeze in one final comment from Craig, a question for Wale. If you were leading Baptist principles and history in a college setting and wanted to embed some of the African thinking you've referred to in the bibliography, what would be your top 3 recommendations? We're teaching it this year partly through biography, and so selecting texts and lives from BIPOC and female Baptists.
In terms of books, are we talking?
I think so, yeah.
I think off the top of my head, Kwame Bediako, book titled Theology and Identity, would be a good starting point. It's pretty dense, but it's a really helpful theological piece of work. I think another one, Craig, he's not a Baptist. Well, he doesn't classify himself as a Baptist, but I like to think he's a Baptist, and he's certainly got a pretty good understanding of Baptist principles, and that's your colleague, Christine, Anthony Reddy. Mm-hmm. Would invite Anthony Reddy firstly to have that conversation with your students. I'm trying to think of another book. I can't think of one on the top of my head, but I think those are 2 pretty good resources as a starting point.
Thank you. And there is one final question. It would seem to me that the voices we need to listen to are the silent and even missing voices. Sometimes we need to go searching for these voices. How committed are we to doing that? Do any of the panelists have a comment on that?
I'd like to think that over the last 30 years, we have begun to become more committed to hearing a wider, diverse voices. I don't know how far we've gone on that journey, and I think that journey continues. But I definitely think that's it. And my comment about looking back at our history, the danger is we just talk about Helwith, Spurgeon, and maybe Bunyan, and we need to make sure that our history is looking at a much wider and diverse history, in that way, so that we hear the wide range of voices.
Stephen?
Well, yes, a simplistic saying that the more voices that are involved or are sought after, the richer the diversity for everyone who's involved, that those both speaking and listening would be enriched by the activity. So it becomes not simply a one-way conversation or even one-way listening, but a mutual exercise in support and concern.
Thank you. And Wale, do you have any comments?
Yeah. I would ask the question, why are those voices silent? What is it within the structures that sometimes prohibit and curtail those voices from being heard? Sometimes we blame the absence of voices onto those who are not able to speak. Often it's because of the environment that those voices try to survive in, finding it particularly difficult to survive. So they feel they have to go underground with their voices, which can sometimes mean that the actual culture, the organization needs to be deconstructed to ensure that the voices on the margins are able to be heard. And that can only sometimes happen when those voices on the margins feel validated and empowered and enabled to speak, which obviously sometimes means there needs to be constructive change within the organization for those voices to be heard. Otherwise, they simply remain silent and forever.
I was reminded actually of the Sam Sharp lecture last year, where the speaker actually drew attention to the women slaves who are absent from the story. And I think there's a really important question to reflect on in terms of how the story is told and from whose perspective, and that we can talk about further perhaps in future sessions also, in terms of how we tell our Baptist story and from whose lens and so on. Unfortunately, time has finished. Sorry, did you want to come in there, Andy?
I think that was something what I wanted to say about slow church. The fast asleep church says we've heard all the voices, there's nothing more needs to be said. The frantic church says we haven't got time to hear any more verses, we've got to get moving and get forward. The slow church says God has given us all the time we need to do all the listening that we need, to hear all the voices that we need. And slow church says we're still moving, we're not standing still, but we're not running so fast that actually we overlook or mishear or don't make time.
Well, and I think also finding the silent voices is often hard work. You've got to dig, and it's not an easy job, but it can be done. And so I think that's where the issue of commitment and being committed to this is also really important. Well, I will draw things to a close now and thank first of all our three panelists for generating some really important discussion for us today, and I know that the conversation could go on much longer, but I want to thank first of all to Stephen and then Wale and Andy for all three of those very different and very equally thought-provoking presentations, which have helped clarify our thinking tonight. I'd like to invite everybody here to join us again, same time, different speakers, different chair, next week when Mark Ord will be chairing the discussion with the theme Discerning Together, in which the keynote speaker will be Karen Smith and respondents will be Gail Richards and Ruth Moriarty. I'd also like to remind everyone that the Baptist Quarterly is a place where lots of issues about Baptist identity, Baptist history and how they're relevant to the church today are explored, and that comes with your membership of the Baptist Historical Society and can be accessed online, not just in print copy. So I would encourage you, if you're not already a member of the Baptist Historical Society, to consider becoming one, and also to draw your attention to the resources that are available on the Baptist History website, baptisthistory.org.uk. And so it just remains for me to thank you all for coming. Thanks again to our speakers, and do spread the word, bring your friends along next time, and also do spread the word that these talks are available online, because there's such fantastic discussions that it would be great to share them with the wider church as widely as possible. So do spread the word. Thanks again for coming. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.